This morning, if you have your Bibles, I'll be reading from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, verses 49 through 51. In the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, beginning at verse 49, it reads like this. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand. He struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran, and he stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, and he drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, David cut off the head of the Philistine with his own sword. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and they ran away. I want to read that verse again. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and they ran away. This morning, I want to speak to all of us using a very familiar phrase. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. You see, as a child, I grew up in the church. And one of the things that excited me about Sunday school was when the Sunday school teacher would teach and tell that story of David and Goliath. You know, giants are intimidating, and at times, giants can be frightening. As a child, I can recall Saturday nights was a big deal. You see, I grew up in the 60s, and being a child in the 60s, monster movies was a big deal. Being a child in 1966, monster movies were the thing. And so on Saturday nights, I'd be at my aunt's house. She had all us kids with her, and she had a lot of sons, big guys, teenagers. And so they would turn to the monster movie channel. So we're looking forward to Count Dracula. We're looking forward to Frankenstein. And now and then you see Wolfman. He'd show up. But the monster that got my attention, that I was always amazed by, was the Cyclops. Cyclops was a giant. Cyclops had one big eye in the middle of his head. And he was intimidating because the earth would move before Cyclops turned the corner. You would shake, the ground would shake, and then here comes this big, huge guy from around the corner. In the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, the entire book of 1 Samuel deals with a battle between two nations. The Israelites and the Philistines were always at war. The Philistines And the Israelites had what you call a generational war. In fact, this war lasted from the time of Eli, who was a priest, to the time of little Samuel, who was a prophet and even grew up and became a man, to the time of Saul, who was the first anointed king of Israel and served for 40 years. The war between these two nations still continued. That's what you call a generational war. It seems as though the war was about to last forever, that there was no end in sight. But see, in ancient times, what they would do to spare the lives of the army soldiers on each side is they would call out champions. And a champion would fight and represent the entire army. Man-to-man combat. Your champion against mine. The Philistines had a champion whose name was Goliath. He was a giant. Goliath, if you're familiar with the NBA, a regulation NBA basketball rim from the ground to the top of the rim is 10 feet tall. Goliath stood 10 feet tall. That's a giant of a man. Not only did he stand 10 feet tall, but the armor that covered his body weighed 125 pounds. That's a giant of a man to move that much armor and not be affected by it in battle. He had a spear, and the tip of his spear weighed 17 pounds. So here it is, the Philistines have their champion. They're ready for battle. They're calling out the Israelites. Where's your champion? The Israelites had an army of at least 4,000 men. I said at least 4,000 men. But no man would step out and face Goliath. They were terrified, trembling in their boots. And then one day, a little shepherd boy, I said a boy, not a man, a boy, a little shepherd boy, he showed up to the king's palace and he said, "King, I'll fight this giant. I'll face this Philistine." So the king, he looks at the little boy and he says, "You have no armor. Here, take mine." Saul was also a big guy. So Saul gave David his armor. David started walking and he left one shoe way back here. He couldn't wear his armor. He was too little. So David, instead of using Saul's armor, decided to use what he knew best. So he used a little slingshot and little 5 stones. A champion, David, found himself face to face with Goliath, unmatched in size, unmatched in strength. It appeared that David had no chance. But I want to say to you this morning, New Hope, that giants come in many sizes, fashion, and forms. A giant, New Hope, is anything that is bigger than you are. You know, we go through seasons in our lives that create gigantic problems. If you're facing a situation that creates a crisis in your life, you're facing a giant. I'll say to you this morning, if you're homeless, you're facing a giant. If you got cancer in your body, you're facing a giant. If you need a heart transplant, you're facing a giant. If there's trouble in your home today, you're facing a giant. If you're unemployed, you're facing a giant. If you're confused, frustrated, suffering from anxiety attacks, need to be medicated every hour and every day, you're facing a giant. My first point this morning, New Hope, is how do you kill a giant? How do you kill a giant? It's easy. You kill giants by trusting in God. You see, David, as a young boy, spent a lot of time shepherding sheep. When David was a little boy, we don't have all the details about his life and what he did while out in the field taking care of sheep. I'm sure he did a lot. But one of the things that we get from David when he was a little shepherd boy is that he walked with God. You see, David, he learned to not only come to know who God was, but he developed what we call an intimate love relationship with God. When you develop an intimate relationship with God, it creates inside of you a tremendous courage and strength. When you develop an intimate relationship with God, you believe that you can do anything. When you develop an intimate relationship with God, just like David here, you believe that you can conquer fear. David, while he was in the field, he learned how to kill lions. He learned how to kill tigers and bears. David, when he was in the field, he might have been killing other things that we don't hear about. But what it was that David developed not just the skill set, but David developed in his mind the concept that fear does not exist when you walk with God. And that's why David could face this giant Philistine with no problem. Because David knew that the God that he served would give him the strength to do anything. David recognized and he realized that victory comes when you have a relationship with God. By walking with God, David, he overcame fear. He wasn't afraid of anything. Second point, no matter what you're going through, no matter what the giants are that you face today in your life, always remember that the battle is the Lord's. The battle is the Lord's. You see, when David was facing Goliath, David knew that his fight was God's fight. See, when you're facing giants, you need to always remember that your fight is God's fight. So no matter how big the problem is, no matter how big the situation might be, no matter what the doctors tell you in that little side pocket room, your fight is God's fight. So don't you worry about what the doctor says. God has the final say. God has the final say. God has the final say. You see, in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 4, the Israelites, the so-called royal priesthood people of God, the Israelites forgot. The Israelites forgot that God had all power and that divine power rests in him. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, these Israelites, they forgot where divine power came from. You see, the devil, his greatest weapon is to make you forget. The devil's greatest weapon is to make you forget who you are. The devil, if he can, he'll make you forget that you're married. He will. He will. He will. That's his greatest weapon. If he can, he'll make you forget to pick up your kids. If he can, he'll make you forget what God delivered you from, and you'll go right back to it. You see, the Israelites, they always on God in battle. God was always with them. He was always with them. But on this particular day of war, the Israelites lost. They were badly defeated. So they reconvened, the generals, they all got together, and they said, God must have slipped up some kind of way. He slipped up, so what we're going to do, we're going to go and get that ark. It was called the Ark of the Covenant, which held the books of the Ten Commandments, 2 books inside. Just a little box, like a little box up here. That's the Ark of the Covenant, and they believed in their minds that the Spirit of God rested in the Ark of the Covenant. So they figured, we're going to go and get the ark and take the ark from Shiloh, and we're going to put that on the battlefield, and we can't lose because we got the presence of God with us. So they went, they got the Ark of the Covenant, they put it right in the middle of the battlefield. So the opposing enemy heard all this chatter, and they're like, what's going on? And another soldier came to him and he said, General, he said, the Israelites got the Ark of the Covenant. There's no way we can win this war. So somebody always show up and say, yes, we can, man. So somebody else showed up. He spoke up and he said, hey, they got the ark, but we got the best weapons known to man. They said, we mastered steel, we've mastered swords, we've mastered weaponry. We can't be defeated as Philistines. So they went to battle. And guess what? They slaughtered the Israelites. They beat the Israelites so bad, it was the worst defeat the Israelite army ever experienced. And not only was it the worst defeat that they ever experienced, but the Philistines even took their box that had God inside. They took off running and they left the box. The Israelites left the box. They left the rectangular ark that had the presence of God. They took off. So the Philistines even had in the mind of the Israelites, they had their God. Can you imagine an entire nation believing that the presence of God is now gone? The enemy has it. That's a sad day of moaning and groaning when an entire nation feels that the presence of God is gone. Here in New Hope, in this congregation, can you just for 1 second imagine that the presence of God is now gone from this place? Imagine in your mind how dark of a place that would put your soul in. How dark of a place that would put your emotions in. Can you imagine the presence of God no longer being in your life? Those of you that have walked with God for some time, I'm sure you've experienced, just like I have, sometime the presence of God when it's gone. That is the darkest moment. Filled with anxiety. You're about to lose your mind because God can't be felt in your soul. That's a dark place. And just think, the entire nation of Israel felt like that this day. But you know what? That was in their minds. They thought that because God never leaves us. In fact, God's presence fills the earth. And not only does God's presence fill the earth, God's presence is so big it fills the universe. That one of my late mentors, Mr. Lowe, used to always say sometime that God is so big the universe have to move over and make room for him. That's a big God. Divine power, New Hope, is never found in things. It's never found, in handkerchiefs. Don't order those handkerchiefs. Divine power is not in handkerchiefs. Divine power is found in God alone. God alone. Divine power belongs to God. Third point, New Hope, and I'll be out of your way. The giant among giants is Jesus the Christ. Why? Because he wasn't like us. That's why. Jesus, he never lied on anybody. Jesus, he was never jealous of anybody. Jesus, he was never in competition with any man. In fact, Jesus tried to build up his brother, not compete with his brother. Jesus was more than a champion. John 3:16 tells us that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. It's Jesus, the Christ, who is the true champion. God's perfect creation was broken. Adam, he had no way back to God. He couldn't do it. God needed more. Our Father needed more than an ordinary man to reconcile and give us a relationship once again, restore that broken relationship between God and man. So Jesus came into this world through a supernatural birth. His birth was not like you and I. It defied the laws of nature. It was supernatural. Jesus the Christ laid the supernatural foundation of Christianity. Christianity is built on a framework of signs, miracles, and wonders. If you call yourself a Christian today, expect miracles. Expect the impossible, because you got a God who holds all power and authority in his hand.